In this video, I'm going to try to take a hand at seeing how this thing works in multimedia, which is to say that I'm going to take a topic that I've recently addressed in text on a post called Thinking and Simulated Thinking, and address it here in video and see what the differences are. So this topic has to do with an effort to consider the different ways that people go about making sense of and responding to their environment, and specifically a distinction between what I'm calling properly thinking and something else that seems to be quite prevalent in our contemporary environment that I'm calling simulated thinking. And the notion is, first and foremost, that inside the concept of thinking, there is at least one major distinction. I'm certain there are more, but there's at least one, which is between an approach to the environment that is tuned to and adaptive to novelty. We might think about this as, well, in the post I call it explore mode. Right? So here we are listening closely, observing closely, very little preconceived notions about what it is that we're perceiving, and in many ways slowly and carefully and somewhat lightly grasping things that are in fact not well understood and endeavoring to come to grips with them on their own terms. Right? So this is explore mode. And then standing in contrast to explore mode is what I called habit mode. So in habit mode, we have some framework for making sense of and responding to our environment. The example I used was after you have learned how to drive a car, the habit of driving a car. So very quickly, you can take your previously generated frame that has very crisp patterns that it can recognize and very specific responses that it can activate. And so in habit mode, our job is to do a good job at quickly recognizing predefined patterns and then effectively executing scripts for predefined and practiced responses. And so these two modes are adaptive to different conditions. When we find ourselves in a circumstance of high novelty, then explore mode is the right approach. And when we find ourselves in circumstances of low novelty, then habit mode is a generally good approach. Okay, so one of the things that I think I failed to do in the text was to really hammer home the fact that the distinction between explore mode and habit mode is not the same thing as the distinction between thinking and simulated thinking. There are different levels of abstraction. So both explore mode and habit mode are properly part of thinking. Thinking involves the skillful and fluid application of these different tools in different environments. In some environments, explore mode is right, in other environments, habit mode is right, and oftentimes one might actually need to go back and forth in the same environment. This is all part of thinking. Simulated thinking, I'm proposing, happens when something breaks down this ability to fluidly participate in both modes. And in fact, maybe even more precisely, is when habit mode shows up as and presents itself as thinking. And this is where it gets very dangerous. Where one is simulated thinking, the individual actually may believe, possibly quite earnestly, that they are in fact actually thinking, when what they're doing is actually running some kind of script, some kind of habit. And of course, oftentimes, some kind of script that was not necessarily even theirs in the first place. They're running a third-party script, malware, as it were, and are largely foreclosed from explore mode. Right? So simulated thinking is that kind of a thing. It is not as simple as merely just habit mode versus explore mode. Okay, so hopefully that point has some clarity. Now, the next thing to think about is why. Why does this happen, and what does it mean? So one piece to look at is that um, simulated thinking superficially outcompetes real thinking in certain kinds of environments, in particular environments that are uh, static over an unusually long period of time, say over a great moderation, particularly when there is some kind of capacity to engage in niche construction, where the agency of some organism is able to maintain the stasis of the environment that they're in um, with their own activity, uh, pushing back on the changes that are happening in the environment. So what ends up happening is that there's a feedback loop. One's own capacity to maintain the long duration of some niche for which a particular set of scripts were well adapted then makes the use of scripts a effective strategy, and the use of thinking a ineffective strategy. And as a consequence, uh, it becomes now possible to begin to optimize for uh, using scripts and to begin to lose the fluid capacity to then use both explore mode and habit mode. And this begins to move you into simulated thinking. However, by itself, I don't think that's enough. I think the next piece that's crucial is to recognize that, particularly in this kind of a static and particularly artificially static environment, simulated thinking wins on a toe-to-toe basis, certainly in the short term, versus actual thinking. Simulated thinking's ability to leverage previously produced scripts and to deploy them rapidly um, looks at first like winning vis-a-vis thinking, which is going to be disoriented and slow and awkward, and oftentimes like saying things that don't even necessarily make sense or using terms inappropriately. It's clumsy, and of course, the longer a particular intelligence has been in a increasingly artificially static environment, the more this is going to be the case. Right? And effectively, if you've forgotten how to do actual thinking, and everything around you has been teaching you to engage in simulated thinking, the act of waking up and beginning to think is going to be looking like a toddler learning how to walk. And so, somebody who has been very well trained as a ballet dancer, in spite of the fact that they may not have done a single moment of innovation or creation in that particular formula, nonetheless looks unspeakably elegant compared to somebody who is beginning the process of endeavoring to learn how to move their body uh, under their own agency for the very first time. We see this actually quite easily in the performance art known as debate. In debate, what we normally do is very much in the direction of a habit mode, and as a consequence, can quite often fall into simulated thinking. A debater is engaging in a pattern recognition and rapid response activity with perhaps a specific small amount of focused thinking controlling the structure. It's a bit like a military commander who's exercising over a very mechanical, old-fashioned, like Frederick the Great kind of military commander, a very mechanical army, but nonetheless, as a leadership possession, still needs to be engaging in some level of thinking. So, in debate, we develop skillful perception of rhetorical strategies and develop a portfolio of effective responses. And then our job is largely to simply deploy this repertoire. And it's habit, right? You practice it. You practice it vigorously and under intense conditions so that you are, like a good boxer, capable of deploying it effectively. Um, and there's utility to this, but I think we should be clear that the primary utility is investing someone in a social conversation. And that isn't at all conducive to collaborative thinking. So that what ends up happening is that when someone shows up who's actually trying to engage in collaborative thinking, and someone else deploys the toolkit of debate, um, the debater will show up as winning, at least to those who aren't watching closely. Um, and the thinker will show up as being oftentimes really rather stupid. And so nobody wants to emulate that. And so what ends up happening is that it begins to select against thinking in both directions, which is to say people who are trying to think lose, and other people don't even try because it just looks like a bad choice. Um, and this shows up all over the place. The political infighting is of this sort. Think about yourself like in an academic department where you have a distinction between an earnest and perhaps somewhat unsophisticated graduate student who's really struggling with something difficult, and a practiced courtier junior professor who's quite skilled in the fine art of using rhetoric to outgroup somebody socially, or politics inside a corporate bureaucracy, inside a boardroom, for example. These are all of the same sort. And the point is that there's a condition under which we first begin to move into an environment where simulated thinking becomes more and more useful, and developing skills in just doing that becomes the way to be successful in your environment, and then also becomes more and more capable of extinguishing thinking, removing it from the field of play. And then this, of course, is a feedback loop. The structures that are able to do niche construction become controlled by those who are engaging in simulated thinking, who then use those structures to maintain the integrity of the environment for which they are well adapted, and as a consequence, become even more well positioned to extinguish thinking and to optimize for simulated thinking, and you find yourself stuck. You're now trapped in a particular niche. And this will last until it doesn't, because at the end of the day, reality is ultimately changing. And so even a very powerful control structure's ability to hold back the waters will all be overwhelmed by something. Something somewhere will ultimately burst the dike, and there will be a flood of novelty that flows into the niche. And intriguingly enough, it generally works in such a way that the more that the niche was constructed, the more that moderation was imposed by agency, the more novelty will rush in. Now, this is a little bit like, or not even a little bit, it's a lot like the relationship between the complicated and chaos that was talked about in the episode on the Cynefin framework. So this is where we find ourselves now. We're in a circumstance where there has actually been a great moderation. There has actually been a significant selection for a long period of time for simulated thinking, and a significant selection against thinking. And at the same time, novelty has been building up behind the dam, massive novelty. And so the dam is now in the process of breaking, and novelty is in the process of flooding. And of course, now what's happening is the niche is shifting, where thinking, and particularly the ability to enter into collaborative conversation, which is where thinking is at its best, is once again being established as fit, as adaptive. And simulated thinking is increasingly showing up as error, as glitch, and in fact, as dangerous error, possibly even bordering on madness in certain circumstances. And that's all I have to say about that. I'm interested to see, for those of you who perhaps have read the post, or and for those who haven't, your thoughts on the qualities of doing this in video versus doing this in text. Is one more effective than the other? Are they interestingly feeding back on each other? Is it worth my time to do both? If you can help me with that one, that'd be great.